The last time I sat in my grandmother's kitchen, the sun was coming through the window at that angle. The late afternoon kind that turns everything gold and a little sad at the same time. She had a pot of pinto beans on the stove. The radio was playing something from the 1960s, low enough that you could not really make out the words. And she was standing at the counter in her housecoat, spooning the beans into 2 bowls like she had done for 50 years. She looked over at me and said, "You know, mija, nobody is going to fight for me except you." I remember thinking she was being dramatic. That is the word for it. Dramatic. I told her everything was fine. I told her the family loved her. I told her to stop worrying. I should not have said that. I know that now, but when you love someone, when you have been watching them feed you and protect you and hold the whole family together since before you could even read, you choose to believe the version of the story that does not break your heart. Her name is Dorothy Mae Calloway. She is 74 years old. She spent 41 years working as a registered nurse at Tucson Medical Center. She raised 4 children in a 3-bedroom house on East Grant Road. She buried a husband. She helped pay for 3 grandchildren's college tuitions out of her own savings account without ever being asked. And in the spring of 2023, her own son, my uncle Gerald, walked into a Pima County courthouse and filed a petition to have her declared legally incompetent. He said she could not manage her own finances. He said she was confused. He said she was a danger to herself. He had already contacted a real estate attorney. Her house, the one on East Grant Road, the one she has lived in for 37 years, is worth $460,000. And Gerald knew that. Look, before I tell you what Gerald did and how it all unraveled, I need you to understand who Dorothy Calloway actually is. Because the way this story gets told in legal documents, in court filings, in the polished language of guardianship petitions, she is reduced to a case number, a subject, an alleged incapacitated person. That is not who she is. She grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, the second of 6 children. Her father worked the railroad and her mother cleaned houses. She tells a story about being 12 years old and deciding, not hoping, deciding that she was going to become a nurse. There was no negotiation in that. No plan B. She got herself a scholarship to the University of Arizona in 1968, packed 1 suitcase, and drove herself to Tucson with $40 and a phone number for a women's boarding house near campus. She met my grandfather, James Calloway, during her 2nd year of nursing school. He was studying civil engineering. They married in 1971 in a church in Tucson with 67 people and a cake that Grandma Dorothy made herself because, she says, the bakeries back then charged too much, and she did not trust people who could not be bothered to bake their own wedding cake. James passed away in 2009. Colon cancer. She sat with him through every round of chemotherapy, worked full shifts at the hospital 3 days a week for the last 8 months of his life, and then came home and cared for him at night. When he died, she did not fall apart. She cried once, she says, in the shower, and then she got up and started making arrangements because someone had to. That is the woman Gerald called mentally unfit. Now here is something I want to be honest with you about, because I think it matters, and because I think you deserve the full picture, not just the version that makes me look like a hero. Gerald is not a monster. At least, that is not where this started. He is my mother's older brother. He is 62 years old. He used to coach Little League in the Rincon Heights neighborhood. He makes decent barbecue on holidays. For most of my life, he was just Uncle Gerald, the one who talked too much about his truck and laughed too loud at his own jokes. But Gerald has also been broke, in one form or another, for most of his adult life. Not homeless broke, but the kind of broke that is always one bad month away from a crisis. A failed landscaping business in 2011. A divorce settlement in 2015 that cost him more than he expected. A second mortgage that he took out and burned through in 18 months. Grandma Dorothy helped him. She always helped him. That is who she is, she helps. She co-signed on a car loan in 2017. She wired him $6,000 in 2020 when he said he was behind on rent. She did not keep a ledger. She did not ask for it back. She just helped. And somewhere in that pattern of need and rescue, I think Gerald stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a resource. That is not something I say lightly, but I believe it is true. If you have ever watched someone quietly reframe a relationship from love to transaction, you know what I mean. It happens slowly. It happens in a way that lets the person doing it convince themselves they are still being reasonable. Gerald convinced himself he was being reasonable. If you have ever loved someone who was being taken advantage of by the very people they trusted most, you already know how this feels. Stories like this happen in families all over this country, and most of them never get talked about out loud. If this is landing close to home for you, stick around. Because what happened next changed everything. The first time something felt wrong, I could not have told you what it was. It was not a fight. It was not a confrontation. It was smaller than that. It was a Sunday afternoon in October 2022. I had driven over to Grandma Dorothy's house. The drive from my apartment in Midtown Tucson takes about 12 minutes, and Gerald's truck was already in the driveway. That was not unusual. He came by most Sundays. But when I walked in, the energy in that kitchen was different. Quiet in the way that means something was just said. Grandma Dorothy was at the table with a cup of coffee, and she was looking at her hands. Gerald was standing near the back door with his phone out. He said real casual, "Hey, just having Mama look over some paperwork." I asked what kind of paperwork. He said, "Just some financial stuff. Nothing major." Grandma Dorothy did not say anything. She took a sip of her coffee. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall that she has had since 1992 ticked. I remember the smell of the coffee and something else. A faint trace of cigarette smoke, which was strange, because nobody in that house smokes. I should have asked more questions. I did not. I sat down and we talked about nothing for 45 minutes, and then I went home. I should have asked more questions. I know that now. Over the next 3 months, there were more Sunday visits with paperwork that Gerald described as nothing major. There were phone calls that Grandma Dorothy mentioned in passing, Gerald asking about her savings, about the house title, about whether she had a will updated. She mentioned them the way you mention weather, incidentally, without alarm, but I started noticing things. The way she would pause a half second too long before answering questions about money. The way she changed the subject. The way, once, she laughed too quickly about something Gerald had suggested, and then looked out the window for a long moment before coming back to the conversation. I am a paralegal. I have been working at a family law firm in Tucson for 11 years. I know what people look like when they are rehearsing a version of a conversation that makes someone else feel better. I know what the pause before the reassurance sounds like. Grandma Dorothy was doing both of those things. So in late January 2023, I asked her directly. I sat down with her at the kitchen table, no Gerald, no other family, and I asked her what was going on with Gerald and the paperwork. She was quiet for a long time. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, and then she said, "He wants me to put him on the house, as co-owner. He says it is for tax purposes." I asked her what she told him. She said, "I told him I would think about it," and then she said something that I have thought about every single day since. "He says I am not thinking clearly anymore. He says it might be better if someone else started helping me manage things." The hum of the refrigerator. The ticking clock. The smell of coffee. And the very specific, cold weight of knowing exactly what that sentence means when a family member says it to a 74-year-old woman who owns a paid-off house. In February 2023, Gerald brought my Aunt Pamela into it. Pamela is his younger sister, my mother's other sibling, and she has always been the family member most likely to go along with whatever Gerald says, because it is easier than arguing with him. I say that not to be cruel. I say it because it is a real dynamic. And if you have a family, you probably know exactly the person I am describing. Pamela called my mother and said she was worried about Mama, that Dorothy had been saying strange things and forgetting appointments. My mother, whose name is Carol and who lives in Phoenix, called me in a panic. I want to be precise about what happened next, because this is where the story stops being vague and starts being documented. I went back to Grandma Dorothy's house. I spent an entire Saturday with her. We talked for hours. We looked through her mail together, her bills, her calendar. She knew what day it was. She knew what her prescriptions were and when to take them. She knew the current balance in her checking account. She walked me through every financial decision she had made in the past 6 months with clarity and specificity. She was not confused. She was not forgetting things. She was a woman who had spent 4 decades as a registered nurse, managing complex medical information under pressure, and she was operating at the same level of precision she always had. What she was frightened. And she was being made to doubt herself. There is a difference between those two things, and it matters enormously. I took notes that day. I still have them. 11 pages in a legal pad that I have kept in the drawer of my desk ever since. On March 8, 2023, Gerald filed the petition. Guardianship and conservatorship of Dorothy Mae Calloway, case number PB 2023-001847. Pima County Superior Court. Grounds cited: alleged cognitive decline, inability to manage finances, risk of self-harm through financial mismanagement. He had attached a statement from a Dr. Kenneth Marsh, a general practitioner who had seen my grandmother twice in 18 months, once for a routine physical and once for a sinus infection, claiming that she exhibited signs consistent with early cognitive impairment. A general practitioner, 2 visits, 18 months apart. He had also attached a financial statement that he had prepared himself, listing a series of what he called erratic transactions, money she had spent or transferred that he considered evidence of impaired judgment. 3 of those transactions were money she had sent to Gerald himself. I am not even kidding. He used the money she gave him as evidence that she could not manage her own money. There is a moment in every situation like this where you get to choose the version of yourself you are going to be. You can be the person who cries about it, who calls everyone in the family and tries to convince them, who makes it emotional and loud and personal. Or you can be the version who gets cold and organized and quiet. I chose quiet. I work at a family law firm. I know what a guardianship petition requires and what it does not. I know what cognitive impairment actually looks like in a legal context and what kind of professional evaluation is required to substantiate it. I know that a statement from a general practitioner who saw someone twice does not meet the evidentiary threshold for incapacity. But knowing something and proving something are 2 different problems, and I needed to solve both of them before Gerald got any further along in this process. The first thing I did was get Grandma Dorothy an attorney, not a family friend, not someone who owed us a favor, a real elder law attorney with litigation experience in Pima County. Her name is Rachel Okonkwo, and she has been practicing elder law in Tucson for 19 years. I found her the same way you find anyone good. I called every person I knew in the legal community and asked who they would call if it were their grandmother. The answer was Rachel Okonkwo, twice, from 2 different people who did not know each other. The second thing I did, and this is the part that took the longest, and the part that felt most like real work, was start building the counter record. I went through 11 months of Grandma Dorothy's bank statements with a highlighter and a legal pad. Every transaction, every transfer, every withdrawal, I categorized them. Groceries, utilities, medical, household maintenance, charitable donations. She gives to her church every month, has since 1984, the same amount, never missed a payment, and the transfers to Gerald, which I itemized separately with dates and corresponding text messages where he had asked for the money. I built a spreadsheet. It took 4 evenings and 1 full Saturday. I sat at my kitchen table with 2 pots of coffee, a printer, and a bowl of cereal that went stale because I kept forgetting to eat it. That is what justice actually looks like, by the way. Not a dramatic confrontation. Not a courtroom speech. A bowl of stale cereal and a spreadsheet at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. But the most critical piece, the one that would change everything, was the psychiatric evaluation. Rachel filed a motion requesting an independent psychiatric examination. The court granted it. The evaluation was scheduled for May 2023, conducted by Dr. Alicia Moreno, a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist affiliated with the University of Arizona College of Medicine. Gerald's attorney objected. He argued the evaluation was unnecessary given Dr. Marsh's statement. The judge denied the objection, and that is where we end part 1. Because what Dr. Moreno found, and what she wrote in that report, was not just a counter-argument, it was a demolition. And Gerald did not see it coming. Nobody did. Not even me. Stay with me for part 2. Because the report is just the beginning. Be honest with me. What would you have done at that Sunday kitchen table in October? Would you have pushed harder? Would you have asked the question I did not ask? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Because for a long time, I asked myself that every single day. And if this story is hitting somewhere real for you, if you know someone navigating something like this, you might want to share it. These things happen quietly. They happen in kitchens, and in Pima County courtrooms, and in the language of nothing major, and just paperwork. And they happen because most people never talk about them. I want to tell you what it felt like to read Dr. Alicia Moreno's psychiatric evaluation for the first time. Because I think people imagine these moments as cinematic. A revelation. A gasp. The truth arriving like a thunderclap. It was not like that. It was a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the law firm where I work, on West Speedway, before my shift started. Rachel had emailed the report at 7:43 a.m. I opened it on my phone. The parking lot smelled like diesel from a truck that had idled past. My coffee was getting cold in the cup holder, and I read 51 pages that, in the careful, measured language of a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist, took Gerald's case apart like a watch you disassemble to show someone how it was never actually working. Dr. Moreno conducted 5 sessions with Grandma Dorothy between May and June of 2023. Not one appointment. 5. Across 6 weeks. She administered the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the mini mental state examination, the clock drawing test, a full neuropsychological battery, a structured clinical interview, and a detailed review of 4 years of medical records. I want you to understand what that means. Gerald's evidence was a 2-paragraph statement from a general practitioner who saw Dorothy twice and diagnosed a sinus infection on one of those visits. Dr. Moreno spent 6 weeks building a clinical portrait of a woman's mind with the precision and rigor of someone who has been doing nothing else for 19 years. The findings were unambiguous. Dorothy Mae Calloway scored 28 out of 30 on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. A score below 26 is the clinical threshold for mild cognitive impairment. She scored 28. For context, the national average for a woman of her age and education level is 24. She scored 29 out of 30 on the mini mental state examination. Her clock drawing test, which measures executive function, spatial reasoning, and the ability to follow complex instructions, was performed without error. Dr. Moreno's clinical summary read, in part, Dorothy demonstrates intact orientation to time, place, and person. Her long-term and short-term memory are within normal range for her age cohort. Her executive functioning is above average. There is no clinical evidence of dementia, delirium, or any neurocognitive disorder that would impair her capacity to make financial or personal decisions. Above average. A 74-year-old woman who her own son had dragged into a guardianship proceeding scored above average on executive functioning. And Gerald knew. He had to have known. Because Dorothy had not changed. She had always been sharp. He had not filed that petition because he believed she was declining. He filed it because he needed something to be true, and he needed it badly enough to build a case around a story he invented. But Dr. Moreno did not stop at the cognitive evaluation. She also documented something that I did not expect to be in that report, and that I think is what made it so devastating. She documented the psychological impact of the guardianship proceeding itself on Dorothy. She wrote that Dorothy exhibited symptoms consistent with adjustment disorder with anxious mood, not pre-existing, but reactive. Meaning the anxiety Dorothy was experiencing was a direct response to being told, repeatedly, by her own family, that she was not competent to manage her own life. Dr. Moreno noted, and I am paraphrasing here because I am not going to read you someone's private medical document, word for word. She noted that Dorothy expressed significant distress, not about her own cognitive abilities, which she described with clarity and confidence, but about being disbelieved by people she had spent decades protecting and providing for. Gerald had not found a woman in decline. He had created one. Or at least he had tried to. Now here is where my 11 pages of legal pad notes and 4 evenings of bank statement work started to matter. Rachel filed the financial counter-evidence as part of our response to the petition. What Gerald had called erratic transactions and evidence of financial mismanagement, I had documented, categorized, and cross-referenced every single one. The full picture looked like this. Over the 11 months Gerald had cited, Grandma Dorothy had made a total of 214 financial transactions. Of those, 191 were routine and recurring: utilities, groceries, medical copays, church donations, household maintenance. 9 were one-time discretionary purchases, all reasonable: a new water heater, a contribution to a grandchild's school trip, new tires for her car. 7 were charitable donations to organizations she had supported for over a decade. And 7 of those transactions, 7, were money transferred to Gerald Calloway. Those 7 transfers totaled $14,200 over 11 months. Gerald had included all 7 in his list of erratic transactions. He had labeled them, in his own filed document, as evidence that his mother could not be trusted to manage her finances. He had taken her money, and then used the act of her giving it to him as proof that she should be stripped of the legal right to make her own decisions. Rachel presented this to the court with clean documentation, transaction by transaction, date by date, and next to each of Gerald's cited erratic transactions, she had inserted the corresponding text message from Gerald requesting the funds, because Grandma Dorothy, God bless her, had kept every text message on her phone without fully understanding why that mattered. She just kept things. She always had. The judge reviewed the counterfiling. He did not say much during that review hearing. Judges rarely do. But I watched his face when he got to the section where Gerald's own transfer requests appeared next to his claims of financial mismanagement. There was a moment, just a moment, where he looked up from the document and looked at Gerald's attorney, and then looked back down at the page. That look did not mean the case was over, but it meant something had shifted. If you have ever sat in a courtroom, even as support, not as a party, you know that these rooms operate on a register that is almost entirely nonverbal. The sighs, the pauses, the direction of a judge's attention. You learn to read them the way you read weather. And the weather in that room, in that moment, had changed. I want to stop here for just a second, because I know some of you are watching this and thinking, why did the family not see this sooner? Why did nobody stop him before it got to a courtroom? And I have asked myself that same question more times than I can count. If you have ever been in a family where one person controlled the narrative for so long that everyone else just accepted it as the weather, you know the answer. Drop it in the comments. I think this conversation matters more than most people realize. The financial hearing was in July. The family dinner happened 3 weeks before that, in late June. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because it is not a triumphant scene. It is not the moment where truth rides in, and everyone finally sees clearly. It is messier than that, and it hurt in ways I did not fully expect. My mother Carol had driven down from Phoenix. My aunt Pamela was there. Gerald was there. 3 of Dorothy's grandchildren were there, including me, and Dorothy herself sat at the head of her own kitchen table, the same table where I had first asked her what was in the paperwork, and watched her family argue about her life. Gerald's position, even after the psychiatric evaluation results had been shared, was that the evaluation was flawed, that Dr. Moreno had not spent enough time, that Dorothy had good days and bad days, and the evaluation had caught her on good days. He said this with the confidence of someone who has never been wrong out loud, and does not plan to start. Pamela did not fully agree with Gerald, but she did not fully oppose him either. She kept saying things like, "I just think we all want what is best for Mama, and nobody is trying to hurt anyone here." That kind of language, the language of false equivalence dressed up as peacemaking, is something I recognize immediately from my work. It is the thing people say when they want credit for being reasonable without taking the risk of being right. My mother was crying by the second hour, not loudly, just quietly, with a balled-up paper napkin in her hand. The way women in this family absorb pain, privately, and without making it anyone else's problem. And Grandma Dorothy. She sat there at the head of that table, and she was still. Not the stillness of someone who is absent or confused or shutting down. The stillness of someone who has decided to let a storm pass over them because they have been through enough storms to know that the only way to survive them is to stay rooted. At one point, Gerald said, directly to her, "Mama, I am doing this for you. You know that. I am trying to protect you." There was a long pause. The refrigerator hummed. The 1992 clock ticked, and Dorothy looked at her son and said, very quietly, "Gerald, baby, I know exactly what you are doing. And I know exactly why. And I love you. But I am not going to let you." Nobody said anything for about 15 seconds after that. Gerald looked at the table. Pamela looked at her hands. My mother stopped crying and just sat very straight. I do not think I have ever loved my grandmother more than I did in that moment. Not because she was fierce, though she was, but because she was clear. She was the clearest person in that room, and she had always been the clearest person in that room, and the entire premise of Gerald's case was sitting right there in that sentence, visible to everyone who was willing to see it. Gerald left before dinner. He drove away in his truck, and through the window I watched his taillights disappear down East Grant Road, and I thought about what it costs a person to do what he had tried to do. Not legally, not financially, what it costs them on the inside. What you have to become to file a guardianship petition against a woman who co-signed your car loan and wired you $6,000 when you were behind on rent. I do not have a clean answer for that. I am not sure there is one. Here is the thing about people who make these kinds of moves. They rarely accept the first setback as the end. Gerald had invested too much. Not just money, though the legal fees were mounting. He had invested the story he had been telling himself about who he was and what he deserved. That is harder to abandon than a legal strategy. 2 weeks before the July hearing, Gerald's attorney filed a supplemental motion. He had found a second physician, a Dr. Raymond Fitch, a geriatric specialist based in Scottsdale, who had reviewed Dorothy's medical records remotely and submitted an affidavit expressing concern about what he called potential undisclosed cognitive episodes. Potential undisclosed episodes. That is the legal language equivalent of saying something might have happened that nobody reported. It is not evidence. It is the suggestion of the possibility of evidence, but filed in the right way, at the right moment. In a jurisdiction where judges are already overwhelmed with caseloads, it can slow things down. It can create doubt. It can cost the person being targeted another round of evaluation, another round of legal fees, another round of sitting at her own kitchen table and being told she cannot be trusted. That was the goal. Not to win. To exhaust. Rachel saw it immediately. She called me the evening the supplemental motion was filed and said, "He is trying to run up the clock and run up her costs. This is not about evidence anymore. This is about attrition." I asked her what we do. She said, "We hit back fast, and we hit back on the record. We do not let this sit." We had 48 hours before the supplemental motion would be formally entered. Rachel filed a motion to strike, attaching Dr. Moreno's full report, with a cover brief that methodically dismantled the evidentiary basis for the Fitch affidavit, including the fact that Dr. Fitch had never met Dorothy, had never spoken to Dorothy, and had based his concern on a selective excerpt of medical records that Gerald's attorney had provided, not the complete 4-year record that Dr. Moreno had reviewed. Selective. That word appeared 4 times in Rachel's brief. 4 times. By the time we walked into the July hearing, the supplemental motion had already been flagged by the judge for a credibility review. Gerald's attorney knew what that meant. He arrived at the courthouse in a suit that was just slightly too formal for the room, the way people dress when they are hoping the packaging compensates for what is inside. Gerald arrived separately. He sat 2 rows behind his attorney. He did not look at me. He did not look at Dorothy. He looked at his phone. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw it. The fracture in the confidence. The thing underneath the certainty that had been carrying him through 6 months of this. He was not a man who was sure he was going to win. He was a man who had gone too far to turn around and was still trying to figure out how not to fall. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. I am going to tell you what happened, in Part 3. Because what occurred in that courtroom, and what happened to Gerald, and what happened to Dorothy, and what it cost all of us, deserves its own space. It deserves to be told slowly, the way the truth usually arrives. Not all at once, not cleanly, just piece by piece, until the whole shape of it is finally visible. I have to ask you something before Part 3, because I have thought about this for a long time, and I still do not have a clean answer. Gerald is my family. He is my grandmother's son, and what he did was calculated, and it was wrong, and it came very close to destroying a woman who had spent her entire life making sure everyone around her was okay. But I also know what it is to watch someone drown slowly and reach for the wrong thing. Do you forgive someone like that? Do you have to? I genuinely want to know your answer. Leave it below. And if you want to be here for Part 3, which is where everything finally lands, make sure you are subscribed. Because Part 3 does not end the way you are expecting. Pima County Superior Court, Department 14, on a Tuesday morning in late July. The kind of morning where Tucson is already at 94 degrees before 9 o'clock, and the courthouse air conditioning makes the whole building feel like a held breath. I had been in courtrooms before, hundreds of times, in my professional capacity. I know the choreography, where the clerks sit, how the bailiff moves, the specific quality of silence that happens when a judge enters, and everyone in the room makes the same small adjustment in their posture. I know all of it. And I still walked into that room with my hands not quite steady. Grandma Dorothy was sitting at the respondent's table next to Rachel Okonkwo. She was wearing a navy blue dress she had owned since approximately 2004. I know this because I have seen her wear it to every serious occasion of my adult life, and she had her hands folded on the table in front of her. Not gripped, folded. The way a person sits when they are at peace with what they have built, and unafraid of who is trying to take it. Gerald was at the petitioner's table with his attorney. He was wearing the too formal suit again. He did not look at his mother. I sat in the gallery 2 rows back. My mother Carol was next to me. Aunt Pamela had chosen not to come. She sent a text that morning that said, "I am praying for everyone." I did not respond to that text. The judge was the Honorable Marcus T. Webb. He had been on the bench in Pima County for 16 years. He had reviewed both the original petition and our counter-filings in advance. You could tell by the tabs in his copy, the handwritten margin notes visible from where I sat. He was not a man who arrived at hearings unprepared. Gerald's attorney led with the supplemental motion, the Scottsdale physician's affidavit, the claim of undisclosed cognitive episodes. He spoke for 11 minutes. He used the phrase erring on the side of caution 4 times. He spoke about Gerald's deep concern for his mother's welfare in the way that people speak about concern when they need it to function as a legal strategy rather than an emotion. Judge Webb let him finish. He asked 2 clarifying questions. The first was about Dr. Fitch's basis for concern, specifically, which records he had reviewed and who had provided them. Gerald's attorney confirmed that the records had been compiled and forwarded by Gerald himself. The judge wrote something down. The second question was whether Dr. Fitch had conducted any direct examination or evaluation of Dorothy Calloway. Gerald's attorney said no. He said the affidavit was based on a records review. The judge wrote something down again. And then he looked up and said, "Thank you, Miss Okonkwo." Rachel stood. She spoke for 8 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform outrage. She presented the psychiatric evaluation findings in sequence, cited the specific cognitive scores, noted the clinical threshold for impairment and the margin by which Dorothy exceeded it, and then, very calmly, in the same unhurried tone she had used for the previous 7.5 minutes, she walked through the financial audit. She placed on the record the $14,200 transferred to Gerald Calloway. She placed on the record the text messages in which Gerald requested those funds, and she stated, clearly and without embellishment, that the transactions cited by the petitioner as evidence of financial mismanagement were, in documented fact, transfers made at the petitioner's own request. The room was very quiet after that. Gerald's attorney started to rise. The judge held up one hand, not sharply, just A hand. A gesture that means, I have heard enough of this particular thread. Sit down. He sat down. Judge Webb reviewed his notes for approximately 40 seconds. I counted. It felt like much longer. The air conditioning hummed. Somewhere behind me, someone shifted in their seat. Then the judge said, and I am going to give you his words as precisely as I remember them, because I wrote them down in my notebook before I left that building. The court finds the evidentiary basis for this petition insufficient to meet the legal standard for incapacity. The independent psychiatric evaluation, conducted by a board-certified specialist over a 6-week period, directly contradicts the claims set forth in the petition. The court further notes significant concerns regarding the integrity of the financial evidence presented by the petitioner. The petition for guardianship and conservatorship of Dorothy Mae Calloway is hereby dismissed. Dismissed. Not continued, not returned for further review. Dismissed. I looked at the back of my grandmother's head. Her shoulders were still. She did not turn around. She placed one hand over Rachel's hand on the table, a brief press, and then she folded her hands again. Gerald stood up and walked out of the courtroom before the judge had finished the administrative close. His attorney gathered his folders in a way that was very focused and very deliberate, which is what lawyers do when they are trying to look composed and are not entirely succeeding. I sat in that gallery for a few minutes after the room cleared. My mother was crying again, the same quiet way, the balled-up napkin. But different this time. The way you cry when something that should not have had to happen is finally, mercifully over. I did not cry. Not there. I just sat with the specific, complicated weight of a thing that went the right way and still left marks everywhere it touched. Here is what people do not tell you about winning. They tell you about the verdict. The moment. The relief. What they leave out is the specific texture of the weeks that follow. The way a family does not simply resume its prior shape after something like this. The way certain silences become permanent. The way Sunday dinners are either very careful or do not happen at all. Gerald did not call Dorothy after the hearing. He did not call my mother. He sent a single text to Aunt Pamela 2 days later that said he had been acting out of genuine concern and that he hoped things could go back to normal in time. Pamela forwarded it to my mother, who forwarded it to me, which tells you something about how that message was received. There was no apology. Not to Dorothy. Not to any of us. Not even the performance of one. And here is the thing that I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count since that July morning. I do not think Gerald believes he did anything wrong. I think he constructed a version of events in which he was the concerned son, acting out of love, undermined by a granddaughter with a legal background and an agenda. I think that version lives in him as cleanly as the real version lives in me. And I do not know what you do with that. I genuinely do not. The legal costs came to just over $22,000. Dorothy paid them herself, from her savings. Rachel offered to pursue a motion for fees. There is a legal basis for it when a guardianship petition is dismissed as insufficiently founded. But Dorothy said no. She said, I do not want any more of my name in any more documents. I just want it done. So it was done. And the $22,000 was done too. A woman who co-signed her son's car loan and wired him money when he was behind on rent spent $22,000 defending her own mind in a courthouse. That number sits in me like a stone. Gerald's attorney filed a motion for reconsideration 6 weeks after the dismissal. It was denied in 4 days. After that, nothing. The case number PB 2023-001847 closed on September 14, 2023. I know the date because I wrote it in my notebook, and then closed the notebook and put it in the back of the drawer. The landscaping Gerald had been doing to fund his appeal costs. He had taken on 3 new commercial contracts, fell through when one of his main clients did not renew. He is, from what I understand through the family information that still reaches me, back to the same financial position he was in before. The same slow-motion crisis. The same one bad month away from a problem. I do not say that with satisfaction. I say it because it matters to understanding what happened. Gerald did not do what he did because he was cruel. He did it because he was desperate, and he had spent enough years watching his mother solve his problems that he had stopped being able to imagine any other architecture for his life. She was the solution. She had always been the solution. And when she said no, when her body of evidence and her own clear mind said no, he did not know what to do with a world where that solution was no longer available to him. That is not an excuse. I want to be precise about that. What he did was a calculated legal action that, if it had succeeded, would have stripped a competent woman of her legal autonomy and almost certainly resulted in the forced sale of her home. That is not a misunderstanding. That is not a mistake made in the fog of love. That is a choice. But it is a choice with a history, and the history matters, even when it does not change the verdict. I drove over to Grandma Dorothy's house on a Saturday in October, almost exactly 1 year after the first Sunday visit, where I noticed the energy in the kitchen had changed. The afternoon light was doing the same thing it always does at that angle, turning everything gold and a little sad. She had pinto beans on the stove. The radio was on, low. She was in her housecoat. Some things do not change. That is the most honest thing I know about people who are truly rooted in themselves. The storm passes over them, and they are still standing at the counter, stirring the beans. We sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours that afternoon. We talked about her garden. She had finally gotten the bougainvillea to climb the back fence the way she wanted. We talked about her church, where she had rejoined the choir after taking most of the year off. We talked about a documentary she had watched about the history of the Transcontinental Railroad and her detailed opinions about its construction decisions. She is sharp. She is present. She is Dorothy Mae Calloway, the same woman she has always been, with the same refrigerator hum and the same 1992 clock ticking on the wall. At one point she looked at me across the table and said, "You know what the strangest part of all of it was?" I asked her what. She said, "For about 2 weeks after Gerald started saying those things, before we had the evaluation, I started second-guessing myself. Not because anything was wrong, but because when someone you love tells you that you are not right, and they say it with enough confidence, and enough documentation, and enough of the language of concern, you start to wonder, even when you know better, even when your whole life has been built on knowing better." She paused. That is what scared me most. Not losing the house, the 2 weeks where I looked in the mirror and I was not entirely sure what I was looking at. I did not say anything for a moment. The clock ticked. The beans simmered. I said, "But you came back." She looked at me like that was the most obvious thing anyone had ever said. She said, "Of course I came back. Where was I going to go?" And she laughed. The big laugh. The one that has been in this family since before I was born. The one that fills the kitchen. I laughed too. And for a few minutes, sitting at that table with the late afternoon light coming through the window, it felt like just that. Just a grandmother and a granddaughter having coffee. Nothing more complicated than that. But I know it is more complicated than that. I think it will always be more complicated than that now. That is the thing about these situations. They do not leave you where they found you. Even when they end well, even when the right person wins, you carry the knowledge of what almost happened, and you carry it the way you carry any knowledge that arrives through a crisis, permanently, in the part of you that does not forget. I have been thinking, since all of this, about what it means to protect someone, because that word, protect, was the word Gerald used. In the petition, in the hearing, at the kitchen table. I am protecting her. I am acting out of concern. I want what is best. That language is so available, so socially legible, so difficult to argue against on its face, that it can be used to justify almost anything. And it is used that way more often than most people realize, in elder care cases, in family court, in the slow erosion of an older person's authority over their own life, by people who have convinced themselves, or simply decided, that their need supersedes the other person's autonomy. The National Center on Elder Abuse estimates that financial exploitation is the most common form of elder abuse in the United States, and that in the vast majority of cases, the perpetrator is a family member. Not a stranger. Not a scammer calling from an overseas number. A son. A daughter. A sibling. Someone who has Sunday dinner at the same table. Most of those cases are never documented. Most of those petitions are never challenged the way ours was. Most of those women do not have a paralegal granddaughter and an elder law attorney with 19 years of experience and a judge who reads his briefs carefully. Most of them are just tired and alone, and slowly convinced that the person telling them they cannot manage their own life might be right. That is the part that stays with me. Not what happened to Dorothy, who is fine, who is stirring beans in her kitchen in Tucson right now, probably with the radio on. But the version of this story where the evaluation never gets ordered, where Rachel is never called, where the petition goes forward and a judge, overwhelmed and underprepared, signs an order, where Dorothy's house goes to Gerald and Gerald's debt, where she ends up in a facility somewhere, her autonomy transferred to a son who decided she was a resource before he decided she was a person. That version of this story happens somewhere on a case number that nobody is writing a script about. It is happening right now. I do not have a resolution for that. I am not going to pretend that Dorothy winning makes the broader problem smaller. It does not. One dismissal in one department in Pima County Superior Court does not change the architecture of a system that is still, in most places, inadequately equipped to distinguish between genuine incapacity and manufactured narrative. What I have is this. My grandmother is 74 years old, and she is sharp, and she is rooted, and she is not going anywhere. She knows what she owns, and she knows what she is worth. And she knows because she has known since she was 12 years old, with $40 and a phone number for a boarding house, that nobody gets to decide those things for her. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. If you have a person in your life, a grandparent, a parent, an aunt, an older neighbor, who is being subtly talked out of their own clarity, who is being told they are confused when they are not, who is being managed by someone with a financial interest in their uncertainty, pay attention. Ask the questions. Stay at the table after the energy in the room shifts. Do not do what I did in October 2022. Do not leave after 45 minutes because the conversation felt uncomfortable. Stay. The last time I sat in my grandmother's kitchen, she handed me a bowl of pinto beans and sat down across from me, and we watched the light change through the window. Gold, and a little sad, and then just evening. The radio played something from the 1960s, low enough that you could not quite make out the words. She looked over at me at one point and said, very simply, "Thank you, mija." I said, "You did not need me. You would have been fine." She considered that for a moment, and then she said, "Maybe, but it was better that I did not have to find out." Yeah, it was. I want to end by asking you something real, not about what you would have done. You already know what I think you should do. I want to ask, is there someone in your life right now who needs someone to stay at the table? Who needs someone to ask the question? Because most of the time, the thing standing between a person like Dorothy and a case number is just one person who decided to pay attention. If this story meant something to you, share it with that person. Or share it with yourself as a reminder. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real ones, complicated ones, the kind that do not wrap up cleanly, subscribe and stay close. Because there are more of them. And they all deserve to be told.